Hello and welcome to this video on Headbanger, bringing heavy metal distortion to Eurorack from Setonix Synth and Robots Are Red. Here's what's to come in the video. This video is sponsored by Setonix and Robots Are Red. I'll start by saying that while this is based on the classic Boss heavy metal distortion pedal, there's loads more to go at with distortion in a modular system than that genre-specific chainsaw saturation. We'll make use of Headbanger in lots of ways in the video, so see the timing index below to skip around the patches, covering a range of approaches and musical styles. And the makers mention this idea too. To quote them, "The Headbanger heavy metal distortion brings the authentic chainsaw sound made famous by the Swedish Death Metal scene to your Eurorack synthesizer. This tonal monster conjures an unholy union between high-quality VCA circuitry and the most legendary distortion circuit in heavy metal. The controls will faithfully recreate that classic compressed grinding Gothenburg sound when fully dimed, but they can also provide a great range of saturation reminiscent of 4-track tape and vintage consumer mixers at other settings. The module doesn't just clone the Boss pedal and call it a day. There's been lots of optimization to make a flexible Eurorack saturation unit suiting to a wide range of input sources. Let's go through the features, and we'll do so in order of the internal signal path too. We have our main input, which first hits an input VCA, which is the gain control, and we have a CV input for gain and a CV attenuator too. This then goes into this doom switch, which is a bass boost on the way into that core distortion circuit, allowing you to throw more low-end weight in, or not. And there's a distortion control here, which controls the drive and clipping of that core distortion that follows the doom bass boost. There's then a free band EQ with a wide 20 dB cut or boost post distortion for shaping that sound, and that then outputs into a crush circuit, and that crush switch engages a soft limiting distortion that limits the output to plus or minus 5 volts. If that's not engaged, it can output a hotter signal. That wet process signal then hits a dry-wet mix control, and there's a CV input and a CV input attenuator for dry-wet blend, and then that goes to the main output. There's then a comprehensive feedback section, which starts at the send output, which is fully wet, straight out of that distortion, EQ and limiting, and that normals internally to the return input, which then creates that feedback loop, but the return input hits a feedback control, which is another VCA with CV over feedback and a CV attenuator for that voltage controlled feedback. And not just having a feedback option in general, but actually having one with CV control and a send and return input and output allows for a lot of creative patching, and we'll explore all of this in the video. So there's lots of patches, techniques and ideas in the video. Those are on screen now, and the timing index is down below for you to skip around. So without further ado, let's dive in. So if you're a French punk that's maybe feeling a bit daft and wants your synth-like lines to sound like guitar-style lines, here's a patch just starting out dry, so you can hear the input. EQ's in the middle. And what's really nice is you can fade across to this kind of slightly fuzzy but more kind of classy guitar amp-like sound. Certainly if you back off the highs and lows a little bit, push into the mids, and then bring some dry back in, this really nice kind of, tubey guitar amp-like sound. But let's just crank it. Yes. It's so hard to resist just cranking the thing. So this one's super fun, creating intense, crunchy, destroyed beat layers, playing around with them post-headbanger in a VCA and envelope, and layering that against the dry sound and kind of performing with filters. Wet sound, headbanger into mailroom's VCA and envelope here. So here's the dry beat. And what's nice here on headbanger, my beat comes into headbanger. I'm going to leave it fully dry on the dry wet blend, so I have the dry output like a split copy. It's just going into the mixer here. The send output is always fully wet, and it's that I want to process, so I don't need a mull or a split cable to split dry and wet in this instance. Now going fully wet, let's just have a play around, crunching up this beat. You can really highlight different areas with that EQ. It would layer either with the dry wet there or dry wet in a mixer. And with that feedback screaming, that's why I started to sequence. And it's this yellow trace here. And you can hear sequencing that feedback. That's almost like a pitch sequence, like a little riff. Gain up full for this works well. You can see the red trace at the bottom of the scope here. I thought I'd just accent around that snare hit with a bit more voltage into gain, just to push it up and back down on that step. Now this just layered against the dry would work well. It's such a big sound. But I really like chopping these sounds up, kind of further rhythmic work in a VCA. So the sound coming into mailroom here to the VCA input and triggering its envelope, which will control the level, and as I lower the release, blue trace there's the envelope out, but it's normal to the VCA here. Really aggressive, choppy, intense 16th notes. But me being me and modular being modular, I thought it would be fun to just modulate the release time with a sequence. You can see the result of that there on the blue trace. So you have yellow trace sequencing feedback, giving a little riff. Red trace pushing in more gain on the snare drum step. Sequence release time, choppy sound, into a filter. Dry out, because the dry wet's dry in the mixer. Send out fully wet through the VCA and filter here. It's a really nice way to work with and to destroy your beats. So typically, distortions like changing sounds in front of them, so you can get an animated sound without even animating the distortion. Say shifting filter peaks and different resonance frequencies. So I've kind of taken that a step further here by just stepped random modulating pretty much everything in the batch. Now outside of headbanger, we have this sound. There's drums, secondary to anything that you can see here. And I have the secondary output on plaques, the aux out here, gone into mailroom, which is an envelope and VCA again. And that's panning around, just serving as a kind of bass layer if you like. Now muting that, here's the output of headbanger. This is Platts with stepped random to all its wavetable parameters, stepped random movement on a low pass filter, then into headbanger with 3 stepped randoms to all of its CVs. If I back these off, that's the stepped random wavetable shifting and filter resonance shifting, or resonant filter shifting. can hear how we get this nice shifting distortion profile because of those changes on the input. So adding in stepped random to things. Got this super steppy, super rhythmic pattern that if we patch it back into the sump pump, it's ducking really aggressively against the kick. But it works really well against the bass layer that arcs out through a VCA. So I bring in headbanger. We've got this kind of centrally panned, screamy, steppy distortion, just shifting softer sound in stereo, and then the beat. I'm muting all this in the mixer externally as usual. It won't be a surprise that I love stepped random if you've seen my videos before. I think it works really well here. Modulated input sound and modulated distortion settings, giving a really super rhythmic, crunchy riff. So thank you to artist Skylid, whose track I'm using here. Over on Modwigler, they said they'd love to hear demos on drones and chords, and I offered to process their audio for them, and they sent in this track. Links to them down below. So here's the sound that I came up with. I tried to process the track through headbanger for something more subtle, but it didn't really work for me. If I mute this in the mixer, here's the dry track, and I thought a bit of subtle warmth might work, but as you'd imagine, a heavy metal distortion isn't the kind of place you might go for that. But what I did come up with, I think gives this lovely blown out destroyed tape that typically I'd mix a lot lower. I think it adds a whole exciting dimension to this track. So the dry is in the mixer here. This is a fully wet chain. If I mute the dry, remove the delay, and a bit of modulation, this is coming into headbanger with an LFO to gain and an LFO to feedback. Now the feedback is based around that return input, which does normals from itself. But I'm actually going to patch in noise here, just a noise source into the return. And hopefully you can hear that fizzy, fuzzy noise sound. And that gain's pushing and pulling, a bit of ebb and flow. That then goes into a crush delay, which is a PT delay, which is fully wet, with some modulation, giving this really kind of wonky, noisy sound in itself. I think it works really well just as a layer against the dry sound. If I turn it down and bring in the dry, there's plenty of artists you could reference that do this kind of thing, and I typically record in this layer as a separate process into a DAW, maybe EQ it, filter it in and out. As a reminder, here's the dry, and then with this, I think it'd actually work panning around. So if you put this, say in this track, just get a LFO to pan, you can actually auto pan this around. That's maybe a bit fast. You get the idea, really fuzz out, blown out tape, noise into the return, LFO to gain, LFO to feedback, warbling chorus, noisy tape delay on top of the blown out headbanger layer. I think it works really well there. So we can't have a heavy metal distortion pedal style module without playing some heavy guitar riffs. And it's really common when you pull up the noise floor with loads of gain on these kind of pedals to run them into a noise gate. So here I'm using the sump pump to the left of the module, which is acting as a noise gate, cutting out that noise, and bringing down the sound to silence in between the louder notes that I play. So here we're looking at enhancing simple synth voices with some headbanger drive, and it was just going to be that, just a bit of drive, a bit of colour, maybe a touch of modulation of it, but it's bloomed into this whole kind of collection of ideas that I think sound really good. So let me pull this back and just show you the dry sound. So I've only one channel active in my mixer, this is fully dry on headbanger, and this is Platts, a common module lots of you have, so it's a nice reference point, with a volt per octave and a trigger, so it's a full kind of complete synth voice, and a little bit of LFO giving this sweeping sync-like tone. When I first played around, taking this wet, and as I was hearing these drive tones, I thought what I'd like to do is bring these in, not on every note. So I started with an envelope, which is the green trace here and this green cable, to the gain. So if we go fully wet and modulate the gain, so you can hear some notes have the extra added drive, some of them don't. And the envelope mailroom here has a modulated decay, it's playing a less frequent rhythm than the main trigger to my main voice, and there's a bit of probability on it, so it's not always happening the same every time, that bit of extra kind of excitement to an otherwise regular synth voice. And then I got into playing with feedback, and feedback when there's silence can lead to some nice kind of howling tones. So pulling this out for a second, I did have something in the return which we'll come to. Let's go fully wet. The blue trace and blue cable is a step sequence to feedback. And I quite like that ampy feedback. Adds a lot of character. So again, winding back the dry wet. We've got this nice kind of interplay between feedback, notes being accented with some drive and gain, and the clean sound coming through as we're largely dry on the mix. Now the next step is to take the send output, which is a fully wet output, and add some effects to it. So muting the main sound in the mixer. This is the fully wet output, the equivalent of just taking the dry wet fully wet on the main out. It's a bit quieter, let's turn that up. So fully wet drive signal with that feedback modulation, gain modulation, and that's coming into my delay. And because this is a less frequent pattern, it's quite nice using that for your effects rather than the main pattern. Going fully wet here. There's gaps where that little bit of noise and that delay can just trail away nicely. And if I bring that up in the mix against the main sound, it's nice to have this fully wet effects chain that's also fully wet on the drive. The difference in colour and tone there creates a really nice layering in the mixer. Now the send input is the wet output normaled back to the send, and that feedback loop's giving that beep beep, that feedback kind of bleep. But you can use it just to inject more sounds into the headbanger. So again, if I mute the effects sound, we could patch in, say, the other output from Platts. We have a second auxiliary out here. And if I turn up feedback, this is the other Platts output. Turning up feedback lets that just drone through. So we have our dry main sound, we're gaining in, modulating in some distortion, and feedback is letting the secondary sound come through. I also like bringing noise in here. I have some in this mult. Those little kind of percussive steps of noise. It's also quite fun, and this is where I'll leave it, with an additional oscillator, just playing the same pattern here. Let's say take a saw, and then modulating feedback. You can modulate in a droning saw into headbanger. And again, it's that blue trace that's bringing in that feedback. I take it up an octave. So full synth voice into headbanger, a nice dry wet blend, a less frequent envelope to gain, which goes from off to gaining in some sound only on certain steps, the fully wet output into my delay effects line, and from a simple source with an additional oscillator here and a delay, we've got a much richer, more dynamic and expressive synth line. That's not too distorted, even though I am just going to distort the hell out of a lot of things in this video. So let's take a look at using headbanger like a wave shaper, something you'd patch right after your oscillator. I have a low pitch triangle here, and you get some pretty gnarly wave shapes that you could then patch around the rest of the system. Let's come up an octave first. As I go fully wet, you can really get in and influence your sound with that EQ, which even more so gets really interactive with the feedback. With that dry wet, you can blend all that sound in, back down an octave, and of course what's interesting, if I just come back up an octave, that particular EQ and feedback I think works as a nice overtone here, but when I drop an octave, these frequencies are static while the input frequency has changed. It's like a static frequency shaper as opposed to say a wave folder that's entirely amplitude dependent. Let's build up a patch where we feed again a basic triangle in, use this and then articulate it as a kind of standard synth voice. So carrying on with the idea of headbanger as a VCO wave shaper, something for the start of the patch rather than the end of the patch, here's that same triangle, just basic VCO wave at the input. Headbanger then into mailroom, which is a VCA with an envelope just to shape the notes, and there's some drums in the background. Let's remove those for now. And this is headbanger through that VCA. And it's almost like a kind of sync overtone, as I mentioned in that previous patch where we just explored turning some knobs on that triangle wave. We have a static feedback and EQ profile, leading to this kind of running tone. And just to get things moving rhythmically here, I have an envelope to gain. Hopefully you can hear that boy, 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 boy. It's a different rhythmic sequence to the one processing the sound. And then some LFO to feedback, and then a sequence to dry wet. So if I back this off a bit, it's almost like kind of complex oscillator tones, just with headbanger and a triangle. So as with any other effect, certainly with distortion here in headbanger, it's not just end of chain, get that earlier in the signal path and play around with where you place it in your patches. So I was nearly done editing the headbanger video and just had a thought that kind of, you know what would really embody the signal path for headbanger, which would be to use it as a kind of dual, slightly dirty VCA. And that's what we're doing here. So just quickly, we have fully wet, no distortion, no feedback to start with. the input gain by voltage controlling it with an envelope works like a VCA. The return input going to feedback is my sub, and by enveloping in feedback, or rather the return input, that works like a VCA, and both are present on that wet path at the output. And then I'm playing with fading to that droning dry input, just with another signal. A dynamic, dirty dual VCA that you can distort if you'd like to. And you have the EQ, which just adds to that character of using it like a VCA. So thanks to Nick, a Patreon supporter, for sending over this nice subby, kind of tubby bass riff. This is fully dry, and it's got some nice triangle harmonics. But I've set up a patch here with the feedback, where the feedback kind of plays in this counter line. Not quite a counter melody, but you'll see what I mean. Kind of got this steppy tonal change on certain notes. Now that changes drastically with the EQ. It's almost like an accent pattern. That's what I mean by like counter pattern, counter bass movement, if you like. For reference, that's the dry. Nice even subby notes. And because of how those notes are interacting with the feedback and the EQ around it, so those higher notes really kind of choke out. Feedback in all its forms continues to just be this thing I'm fascinated with. Let's take a look at audio rate modulation here. I have an interesting wave from Platts, just for something a bit more spicy. And then we have audio rate modulation, which is a sine. The blue trace here is the output of Headbanger. And everything here will take audio rate modulation. Let's start with the gain. Feedback. And dry wet. So let's use this more musically in a patch. So here's applying audio rate modulation musically. You're currently listening to the output of Headbanger into two low pass gates, with the trigger rhythm separated between them, so it's pinging on the left and right sides with a touch of delay. Muting that, here's the direct output. It does make me smile. So if I remove the modulation here, and let's patch the modulation straight in. This is that same kind of interesting wave I mentioned from Platts with a peak and some wiggles. Here it is dry. And then the audio rate modulation plays the same pitch sequence. It's not shown on the scope with how I've repatched it, but it's just a sine wave. So if I bring that in, it's a nice musical tone. And again, we could patch that, say, to dry wet, which would also work well. But let's stick with it in the gain. So that's just statically patching it straight in, but we can be dynamic with modulated modulation by patching this through a VCA with an envelope. And now each time a note plays, my modulation goes up and down. And if you listen to this one, let's actually patch this into the mixer here. That's the modulation signal. Patching that into Headbanger. We get these dynamic chugs of audio rate modulation coming in and out. I hope you're headbanging. So muting that back into 2 low pass gates. It's rich, dense material for things like low pass gates to just be plucked and struck. Feedback will get this croaking. I hope you've enjoyed the video and have been left with ideas not just for Headbanger specifically, but for distortion in general too. Head to patreon.com/DivKid to gain access to exclusives, join the DivKid Discord community, and to support what we do. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!